This is my 22nd year in the National Park Service, and what I'd just like to do is give you a little bit of history of Whitehaven and Grant and his importance to this area. It actually begins in a horseback ride from Jefferson Barracks to Whitehaven in February of 1844. Now this is a ride that Grant has taken many times before, but there's something special about this ride which will forever change the course of American history. Grant had made many trips in 1843, but when he came out in February of 1844, for the very first time, he met someone by the name of Julia Dent. And as he said in his memoirs, his visits there became far more frequent. The Mexican War was brewing and Grant was ordered south. But just before he left, he went over to Whitehaven for what he thought might be the very last time, and he proposed marriage to Julia Dent. On the porch there at the house, which is the National Park Service site, and Julia accepted. So when he came back in 1848, they were then married. Now, during this time, Julia has given birth to 2 of their children, and because of his army assignments, he's never been present for any of those births. And so in 1844, while he's in California, he abruptly resigns from the army and returns to Whitehaven. And I would suggest to you that the next 6 years of Grant's life was some of his happiest. For the first time, he's able to fulfill those 2 roles, which he so dearly loves, that as a father and as a husband. And Julia gives birth to 2 more of their children during this time. And eventually in 1860, the Civil War erupts. But he's stopped by the Illinois governor, who gives him an Illinois regiment to command. Imagine how much different American history would have been had that Illinois governor not stopped Grant, and Grant would have spent the entire war at a tanner shop in Galena, Illinois. A meteoric rise in rank during this time. He goes from being a colonel of a regiment all the way up to be a brigadier general. And he makes this ascendancy without having any combat in the Civil War. But when Grant approaches Fort Donelson, the Confederates refuse to surrender. They actually attack, Grant responds, and then there's a temporary siege. And from this siege, Grant will receive a nickname which will carry for the rest of his life. Eventually, the Confederates realize they cannot overwhelm his forces. So they ask him, what terms of surrender will he require? Grant quickly responded, the only terms of surrender that he will accept is unconditional. And the Confederates surrender, and he's forever known as, instead of Ulysses S. Grant, as Unconditional Surrender Grant. And on July 4th of all days, Vicksburg surrenders, and Grant receives the surrender of the largest Confederate army to date. Now, 3 years have passed in the war, 1861, 1864, and finally, in March of 1864, for the very first time, Lincoln and Grant actually meet. Imagine. Grant has led these armies through 3 major incursions. Grant and Lincoln have never shook hands, they've never had a conversation, they've never studied a map together. And despite all that, in March of 1864, Lincoln makes Grant commander of all the armies in the Union forces. Now after the election in 1865, Lee eventually started his retreat, and Grant captured him in Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the American Civil War. A few days later, Lincoln was shot and killed. Grant was at the funeral in the White House, and as he stood at the foot of the coffin, a man who was known to be high stoicism and not showing public emotion whatsoever, openly wept at the base of Lincoln's coffin. Now, after the Civil War, Grant's popularity in the North was beyond measure. And in 1868, he wins election as the 18th President of the United States.